it, it was just speaking to me. Hey, this is Jeannie, SLP. I got some information today. There were some questions here about speech and language acquisition as a bilingual child and what to expect, maybe some resources. And so I figured I was like, oh, I'll just make the Zoom video or what have you, just to see if some of the things that I have is actually helpful for you. So let me share screen. So I'm not good with technology. Okay, get rid of that. So what I have here is a Google, like a Google Drive folder.
How can I help?
Oh gosh, now my phone is talking to me because I said Google. Okay, so this is a folder that I'm hoping to share with you. I have your email address now. So I'm hoping to give you access to this. And these are some of the more pertinent resources that I use when I'm writing a report for a student after I've done an evaluation for them. And again, this is preschool aged, but it has some things that are it's good information for some of our younger folks. So I'm gonna hit on this developmental speech and language norms for Spanish and English document. Let me move myself out of the, I'm always in the way. Let me just download it so that we can just more easily look at it together. And so this is a resource that I found through bilinguistics.com. I'm pretty sure the name is printed somewhere down below here. So developmental speech and language norms for Spanish and English. Here it is, bilinguistics. All of this information was compiled by a man named Scott Prath. He's a speech language pathologist, and he works for Bilinguistics. And I'm so fortunate to be actually linked with him, in a professional capacity. And I recently was like, dude, I got to thank you for all of these resources that you've compiled for us, because for me to sit down and read 50 to 100 research articles to just grab certain information, he's got it all compiled into one area. And I'm like, thrilled. Thank you, Scott. So kind of popping down, the first pages down here, we have apples to apples. This is some of the basic information that I look at for my bilingual children. And really and truly, this information is not specific to bilingual kids. Bilingual children, their development is very similar to monolingual kids. So here's they have here the building blocks for speech. Yeah, of course, by 1 month, they're going to be crying. They're going to start doing a lot of babbling. They're going to start repeating you. They're going to start, just saying random words that don't have meaning. That's awesome. And that's up to 12 months. But then by 12 months, we hop over to vocab development. And that's when we really want to see first words, usually labeling familiar objects and things like that. As they age, we want to see that vocab level go up. You can see, like for a lot of the kids I see, they come in about age 3, and they should have 1,000 words in their vocab. And some of the kids that I evaluate have like 5 words in their whole vocabulary. So that's really tough to see, considering that monolingual or bilingual, whatever the case is, they really should have about 1,000 words in their vocab. So that indicates a lot of delay. So you can see the progression from crying all the way to, over 1,000 words. Also, some of these building blocks for language, they're talking about having that eye gaze, using that joint attention. Like if I'm with you and I have this water bottle, like we're both looking at the same thing, right? So that kind of joint attention, using gestures, pointing, things like that. They'll follow simple commands, have different types of play, pretend play. I'm going to pretend that this is an airplane, things like that. Yeah, there's the different types of play. There's symbolic versus episodic. Frankly, I don't even know what the heck that is. So I am not super well versed in play, and I think that probably would have given me an IEP back in the day. That's okay. So for speech intelligibility down here, some of the things that's really important are to kind of consider familiar listeners versus unfamiliar listeners. So like a familiar listener is a parent or any family member that lives, within the home. And so by age 18 months, they should be approximately 25% intelligible. By 2 years, 50 to 75% intelligible to a familiar listener, right? Like you're not always, as a parent, going to understand what your child is saying. A lot of times they're not saying anything that's very clear. It requires time to work that out, but by 3 years of age, they should be about 75 to 100% intelligible to the family, to parents. For unfamiliar listeners, around 18 months, about 25% intelligible, about 75% intelligible by 3 years of age, and should be fully intelligible by 4 years of age. That means that as an unfamiliar listener, me going into an evaluation setting, I can understand what the child is saying 100% of the time. So that's the expectation. Anything else would require us to look into that and just make sure that there isn't any like speech sound production issues hindering them from saying things clearly such that other people can't understand it. Could also be that they're just not forming sentences and it's hard to understand what they're saying because they don't have the language needed to be understood. So there, a couple of things to look at there. But it's important to note down here at the bottom right, bilingual children develop early vocabulary at the same rate as monolingual children. Thank you, Scott, for pointing that out. Early language milestones are similar, okay? Single word use, again, coming through at like 12 months of age. And then, of course, adding on to 2-word phrases by the time they're about 2 years old. That's all similar between monolingual or bilingual. Popping down, the next part goes into articulation and phonological development. That's really that speech sound production that I was telling you about, those speech sounds within words. And they have these really cool, I'm going to try and orient this such that we can look at it head on. Sound expectations by age. So this means 4 years of age, 5, 7, 7.5, 8.5. And this is in English. That we would expect children to be able to use h, b, n, w, p sounds correctly in words by age 4. Moving on to age 5, it's k and g and d and t and yeah. So that's kind of a gauge that we have for English in this particular section. There are some other resources out there that will say, no, k happens in 4, when they're 4. It just depends on what research you're going by, but this is a pretty good guideline for when kids should master certain sounds. But I like down here how they have it separated out into Spanish too, because it is different. There are different sounds in Spanish than there are in English. In fact, there's a lot more sounds in English. It's kind of crazy that way. But in Spanish here, we have by age 3 that the students will have mastered use of the b, and p sounds. Those are what we call bilabial sounds, where we're using both lips to produce them. So when I have my students who I'm evaluating who are age 3 or higher, and they're not producing those sounds, they might be saying ato instead of pato, right? I'm like, wait, hold on a second. They should definitely be saying the P. They should be able to do that. So you can kind of see here, age 3, mba pa, and then age 4, it kind of goes on. And you can compare as well. There's probably a slide here. Let's pop to it. Let's see. Hop, 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 hop to it. Oh, here we go. And I have to orient us back to normal. This page shows the different consonant speech sounds up top that are unique to Spanish, and the sounds that are unique to English, and the ones that are shared. So this is really cool. So of course, like what's unique to Spanish would be the ñ, like we don't have mañana, like we don't do the ñ. Also the flap R, like the like pared, like that kind of little tap. We don't do the rolled R, and we don't do the sound like I know we talked about hijon, right? We don't really have that sound in English. So that's off to the left for Spanish only. Then those are the shared sounds right here. And then for the English sounds that are unique to English, it's definitely the voiced TH, the voiceless TH, j, like when we say walking, that ng sound that usually comes at the end of the word. Sh, v, z, zh, and then our Americanized R, you know, that's even in British English, it is different than in Spanish. So that's kind of how we break it out. If I had a student who, you know, is a bilingual student who has trouble producing the j sound, which is specific to English, I don't really flag that because they're not exposed to English as much as monolingual kids who are only exposed to English, right? So they should have it, but I'm not really gonna, you know, flinch all that much when a student who's learning to speak both Spanish and English can't quite do those sounds that only occur in English or only occur in their second language. Same thing for someone like me, like obviously it's important for me to have appropriate articulation with my position. However, being a bilingual person, I wouldn't be like, oh, that person is like needs therapy, needs help because they can't do the rolled R or things like that, right? So what I like to focus on really for bilingual kids is that they're making sure that they're producing the sounds correctly that are shared between both of those languages. And here it's b and d, g, p, t, k, s, ch, y, o, f, w. Okay, those are some examples. So that's kind of where my thinking goes. It's like, don't get worried on those kind of fringe sounds so much, but just make sure they're able to use those shared ones. This is just comparison of the vowels that we have between both languages and what's shared. Obviously with Spanish, it's super easy. It's a, e, o, u. There's 5 of them. But in English, we have a lot more vowels. We a, o, which is so interesting. Like for me, when I say coffee, right? I'm not saying coffee, which would be the ah. I'm not saying coffee like other people do. I say coffee. So we have just some variations of vowels within English that aren't necessarily in Spanish. So that's kind of cool. Hopping down to a different idea of speech sound production. We, in our field, talk about articulation, producing those speech sounds that we just reviewed. But then there's also like, we want to look to see if there's any patterns of error. Sometimes, you know, like I had said before, we expect kids to be using the bilabial sounds, and you might get a kid that says ato, and they're not saying pato, and you're like, but puh, they need to be saying that. But if you look further, there may be a chance that it's not that they can't produce the p at all. It might be that they're doing a pattern of error where they're consistently not producing the first sound of the word. So that's where this comes into play, where this says initial consonant deletion. Maybe they're saying ato for pato, and then they're also doing that with gato, and they're just saying ato, or they're also saying that for bañar, where they might say añar, right? Or something. Whether it's English or Spanish, those are those patterns of error that we also look at, not just the speech sounds. And so you can get a feel for when, you know, those are developmental up to a certain point, meaning they're appropriate. Kids don't just come out of the womb speaking correctly. They go through these different processes, and then they eventually learn how to say things properly. So for initial consonant deletion, omitting that first sound of the word is somewhat appropriate and developmental until age 3, at which point we would expect use of that process to be eliminated. So if a child is age 3, exposed to either English or Spanish or speaking both, we really don't want to hear them omitting initial consonants, because that is going to make it so difficult for them to be understood, because that's at a single word. You throw a single word into a sentence and it's tough. So that's kind of a pattern of error that I'm talking about here. There's a whole bunch of them. Final consonant deletion is one. You know, if a kid is saying calf or cat, by age 3, that should be eliminated, meaning they should be producing final consonants by then. Again, there's more final consonants in English than in Spanish. In Spanish, it's N, L, D, S, and R, there's only 5 consonant sounds that end words. Whereas in English, there are so many more. So if I'm noticing that maybe they're omitting sounds at the end of words in English for sounds that aren't in Spanish, it's not as big of a deal. But if they're omitting N, L, D, S, or R in either English or Spanish, then that's an issue. And that should be eliminated by age 3. Another phonologic process is weak syllable deletion. Lots of my kids, they come up and they're like, "Fante" for elefante, right? So they've totally omitted a couple of syllables from that entire word. And of course, in Spanish, the words are just so much longer. You know, in English, we're like, yeah, put on your shoe. Shoe is 1 syllable, but then in Spanish, we're like, ponte el zapato. Zapato is 3 syllables, and that's just, it's really hard. So over time, you want to see them getting better at it. But again, by age 3 in Spanish, here it says, and by age 4 in English, we want them to be producing all syllables in words and producing words as they should be. There's something else called medial consonant deletion that should be eliminated by 3 in Spanish and 4. They have some examples here, and you can take a look at them. Cluster reduction, that's an older one. Gliding, assimilation, down, whoop, 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 whoop. Substitution processes here. Assimilation, meaning like they might not say, here's one, gato. They might say tato, because there's another sound in the word that they're just kind of repeating, but in the beginning. Assimilation, again, that should be eliminated, cut out by age 3. Backing, I recently had to do for my schoolwork an analysis of language, and the child was saying, what was he doing? Oh, I can't remember the word now, but he was using g instead of d. And I can't remember exactly what he was saying. I think it actually was maybe about a dog, and he was saying ga instead of dog, or trying to make an approximation like duh, like that would be more appropriate than ga. And I would consider that backing. He's using a backed sound ga in place of a front sound duh, you know, produced in the front of the mouth. Stopping's another thing. So he said, he was like trying to say, what's wrong with her face? You know, her face was dirty in a picture. And he said an approximation, pace instead of face. But because F is a sound that doesn't really stop, but he's using a really short sound, we call that stopping. And again, that should be eliminated by 5 in Spanish, by 3 in English. They have a bunch of other examples. So those are phonological processes that we look at. So kind of stopping here for a moment, I'm going to go back to the folder that I'm going to share with you. And Scott and his team with Bilinguistics created just a few. I actually have this as my work laptop background, so that whenever I'm writing reports, I can just easily look at it and get it. The shared and unshared sounds in English and Spanish, the speech intelligibility idea that we have, like that is so important. That's a great measure sometimes, like, if I can't really understand the child, maybe we should have an evaluation or something. So speech intelligibility here. The sounds as they're acquired by age. So by age 3 in Spanish, we expect these 3 sounds. By 4, Spanish and English, and going on. And then down here, we also have the phonological processes. I am going to point out that right here, I don't know if you can see that, there's a typo, and that just really, that bothers me. But anyway, it's fine. The rest of the information is actually accurate. I did double check that, so we're good. So just so you know, that's in there. But I want to head, I think it got, nope, up here. I want to head back to that pamphlet of Scott Pratt's, because as you go down below, now that we've already talked about the speech sound production, phonological processes, we're interested in language itself. And we already talked about how there's vocabulary development expectations that we have. But what about actual language, putting language together and understanding language? So that's the expressive and receptive language pieces. So expressive language, what can a child say verbally to communicate? Receptive language, what can the child comprehend of what other people are saying to follow through with a direction, right? Or to understand what they're talking about. That's receptive language. So down here, we have some developmental norms for language that you can take a look at these. Go through the list. By 5 months, do they react to loud noises? Do they vocalize? Do they make sounds? Do they move their eyes towards a certain sound? If you're like, do they go like this? 6 to 12 months, of course, they have different ideas. 1 to 2 months, 1 to 2 years, excuse me, is where we start seeing children following simple commands, right? Put it in the trash, right? And sometimes they'll be able to start understanding that at that age. Begin to respond to questions, engage in play, start combining 2 words. I really like to say that by 1 year of age, they're producing single words, usually 1 word. By 2 years of age, they should be producing 2 or more words to communicate. By 3 or more words, things like that. That's kind of my gauge. So yeah, I would expect to see kids combining words between 1 and 2 years of age. Some kids are sooner, some kids are slower than that, but either way, this is a pretty good guide. By 2 to 3 years, they should be responding to yes or no questions, combining 2 to 3 words to comment or request or inquire. Has some grammatical features that we would expect, like using, instead of just saying she runs, you could say she is running. That's the present progressive verb form, verb tense. Ella está corriendo en vez de ella corre, right? So just a little difference there. This one kind of has a little bit of the consonants that are expected there. Use of the plural form. Speech is understood by familiar listeners most of the time. They start using that past tense, talking about things that happened. Following 2-step directions as well. So like by 1 to 2 years, we're talking about just following simple commands. By 2 to 3 years, we're talking about, instead of just saying, put it in the trash, right? We would say, stand up and put your food in the trash. 2 things that the child has to remember. They have to stand up and then they have to put their food in the trash. So that's what we mean by 2-step directions there. And then 3 to 4 years, it just keeps increasing the different grammatical complexity of what we would expect. We would expect them to be able to use the possessive, like, that's mommy's pen, right? Saying that that's mom's instead of just saying the pen, because then nobody would really know, well, whose is it? Things like that. Start using negatives in sentences, answering who, what, when, where questions. By 3 to 4 years of age, like we said before, the child should be generally understood by everybody, not just the family, but everybody. Combine 4+ words to communicate. So we're not just saying water, right? We're not just saying I want water. They're using 4 or more words, like I want cold water. I want water now. Like just adding extra information to the things that they're saying to be better understood, to be a better communicator. And then of course, 4 to 5 years, it just keeps going up until 9 years here. But this is just the list as it stands here. It just depends, I think, like visually what you prefer. This is the list. I'm a more visual person, so I like this one down here. It's the same information, but it shows you receptive language on the top, that comprehension of language, and the expressive language on the bottom, and the expectations. So I'm more of a visual person in that way. So take a look at it in this section. And then something I think that's more specific to me and like what I do as an SLP and when I'm evaluating kids, there's not a lot of research out there for bilingual children. And of course, it's tough. There's so many different types of bilingualism. There is, simultaneous bilingualism, where children are exposed to both Spanish and English at the same time from birth all the way up. That's a different type of bilingualism than sequential bilingualism. Like for me, I learned a second language outside of English after age 3. That's considered sequential bilingualism. Well, are simultaneous and sequential bilingualism the same? Not really, but there's not really any research that's really robust separating the two out, or really just bilingual research in general. It is just so new. The idea that bilingual therapies and testing bilingually is important is a new thing. So hopefully we'll have more research out there. But one of the things that we have that we use as a guide to, is a child showing expressive language delay? I use a mean length of utterance in words. So for example, like we said, by age 4, I expect a child to be using an average of 4 or more words in their utterances. That's a mean length of utterance in words. That's an average. I want to see an average of 4 words per utterance, right? And so you kind of go through that way. And that's what I use, MLUW, mean length of utterances in words. It's not marking things wrong, like a bilingual child who maybe isn't using, the third person singular verb form correctly. It's not going to ding them for that being wrong. What it is going to show is that the child is adding more information to their sentences as they age. And that's more important than showing that bias of like, well, they're not doing English correctly, right? We're not going to ding them for not doing morphological things correctly, as we would if a child were just speaking English. So that's kind of what that section's about. Probably a little over your head, perhaps. I mean, I'm sure you understand it, but it's not really necessary for the concerns you might have at this point. And then that's the end of that document there. And so I'll just stop sharing. Oh, no, let me just go back and just make sure that that was it. Oh, here's some common language differences that I have, which is interesting in the studies that I'm doing right now, which is just like I was saying, like we use mean length of utterances so we don't ding kids for having specific differences in their language because they're bilingual. So here's an example, word order. So if I were going to say the blue house in English, I'm using blue before I say house, the blue house. That's how we do it in English. That's the adjective. It comes before the noun. The adjective is blue. The noun is house. But in Spanish, it would be la casa azulada, right? Where the adjective, the color, is coming after the noun. So in Spanish, the word order is a little bit more fluid and flexible than it is in English. And what would happen is if a child, if we were looking at their sentence and we were like, well, they didn't do that right, whereas when we're looking at MLU and we're just kind of looking at their sentence as a whole, we're not going to mark them wrong for that. We're going to be like, hey, this kid is using a 3-word utterance and it's beautiful. It's a different word order, but it's still the information we want to hear. They're being an effective communicator. It's more like an English as a second language issue. It's not an actual issue. It's not an actual disorder. It's just a difference. And so there's a lot of other examples here. Like sometimes, kids who are learning English as a second language may not use the past tense ed. It may not be there. We walk yesterday instead of we walked yesterday. Well, why, when you're learning a language, why do you have to say walked when you're already saying yesterday? It's like redundant, and you don't, as an English language learner, you're like, why do you have to say everything twice? Like, why do you have to mark the past tense and then also mark it again by saying yesterday, right? Just things that are common differences. And then of course there's some common differences also in articulation, right? Where, when I said that the V sound doesn't exist in Spanish, but it does in English. So then in English words, people might say a B for a V because that's kind of a close approximation. So my brother and my dad's names are Everton. So whenever, when I was studying abroad, they would always be like, oh, tu hermano, Everton, right? They would use B instead of V. And it's fine. It's not a disorder. It is a difference. That sound doesn't exist in Spanish. So obviously the child may not be able to say it, or adult even say it correctly. So those are some of the examples of differences. So I think that that's just about it for what's in the Google Drive for you. But I did want to pull out my textbook, Dual Language Development and Disorders textbook that I'm actually using in my coursework right now. And I just wanted to kind of go through for some, I'm using everything as bookmarks in here, including my medication. So one of the things when we're talking about bilingual development this it was kind of frustrating, but in this book, it was talking about how, you know how we always say that kids are sponges and they learn everything? This book is basically saying, hey, no, that's false. The kids are not sponges. What they do need to have is they have to have a lot of exposure. So in order for a child to be bilingual, if that is the goal, if that's the goal that you want the child to be able to use Spanish and you want the child to be able to use English, it is all dependent on how much input you give to the child. So let me see here. I have something highlighted here, and it says, Pearson and her colleagues from 1997 found that Spanish English bilingual children who received less than 25% of their input in Spanish often did not become fluent Spanish speakers. So, well, that stinks. So it could be that a quarter of their day, for example, a quarter of the time at home, they're being spoken to in Spanish, and it's not helping them. They need a lot more input in Spanish to become a fluent Spanish speaker. The same thing goes for English. And I see that a lot where there's that idea of subtractive bilingualism, where a lot of my students come in, they only speak Spanish, but then their academic environment is only in English. That's a big portion of the day. So what do you think they naturally tend to do? They naturally tend to go the English way, and the Spanish falters. And I have a lot of kids parents who, they're like, what do I do? And I'm like, you have to speak to them in Spanish. You have to make that your deal. And it's really hard in those big families where, parents are working 2 and 3 jobs, both of them. And, the kids are exposed to English all day. Then they come home and all their siblings are speaking English, and that's all that they speak. But you speak Spanish to them, but it's not the input that's required for them to really become bilingual and become proficient in speaking in that minority language, which would be in the US, Spanish. So that's really important. And also the quality of the input when we talk about families who don't really have access to a lot of resources, including money, low socioeconomic status families. It's really difficult to give your child that really thorough and robust input quality that's needed for kids to really solidify that minority language and keep it along with the majority language, English, in the US, I'm talking. So really that input is very important. Keep it going. What was the other thing I had here? Hold on a second. All right, so now the blue pen is telling me. So the other important thing is to discuss code mixing and code switching. So I think a more familiar term is code switching when we're talking about adults, who you could say, quiero ir a la store. Well, I just inserted an English word into my Spanish utterance. That is so code switching, right? It could be that maybe I forgot the word, or that word came to my mind faster. It's not wrong. It's beautiful. Code switching is actually totally typical and acceptable as long as it follows the same, grammatical idea. So if I said, yo quiero ir al tienda or al store, that doesn't quite make sense because the gender is not following. So that might be an indication of something, but code switching generally follows the same grammatical structure, but you're just inserting a word or words from another language. So code switching is what adults do. Code mixing is what kids do. And again, like I said, it is totally acceptable. Code mixing, it could be intra-utterance code mixing, and that's when you have 2 different utterances in the same conversation. So I could say, Mommy, yo quiero agua. I'm really thirsty, right? I said 2 sentences, but I used 2 different languages to communicate to someone else, right? So that's intra-utterance code mixing. Or inter-utterance code mixing. Inter-utterance is kind of the example I had before, where in the middle of the sentence, I used a different language for a word, right? And that one was like, yo quiero ir a la store. That one's inside the utterance. So those are the types of code mixing, and it's actually okay. It's cool. However, what I wanted to bring to your attention is that adults who are trying to teach children language, right, should avoid that. The models, very similar to that input, the quality input, if we're inputting Spanglish, as we call it, or code mixing to the child, they don't really have a solid Spanish or a solid English example for them to really acquire that language. So as adults, as an SLP, I really try not to do that for any of my students that I'm teaching language to, because I want them to have the full example of vocabulary and grammar in the target language, whatever language we're using in that moment. So just so you know, try not to do that when you're trying to teach your kid language. But if the child does it, that's cool. If another adult comes to you and starts speaking like that, it's totally cool. It's just that what we want to do is help our kids out, give that robust input, really help them, latch onto the language. And then the last one is my yellow highlighter, my ghetto bookmarks. And it's kind of talking about immersion education, and that is important for we're not there yet. Kids young, we're not there yet. But it is important to kind of consider what you want for your child in the future. We're very fortunate in the area in which we live, the time in which we're living in. There are a lot of dual language programs. We want to avoid subtractive bilingualism. We want to avoid you putting in all this hard work to have your child be bilingual, then be bilingual, and then all of a sudden they go to school and the Spanish is gone. The Spanish takes the back seat and it's gone. We don't want to see that. So when you have dual language programs that may, it depends on the school. Some of them do a whole day in English, the next day is a whole day in Spanish. Other schools do it such that, these specific subjects are taught in English one day, then taught in Spanish the next day. Or maybe they have specific subjects that are specifically done in Spanish and specifically done in English. It just really depends on the type of program that you have and what's out there. But those dual language programs are really the best in terms of preserving that bilingualism, which is beautiful, which will help your child in the future. And not only just, work-wise or communication-wise with other people, but it actually is good for the brain. We're trying to think of vocabulary in two different languages. I mean, think about how much more work our brain is doing and how much more is going on up there. And they do say, research shows that bilingualism actually helps ward off certain types of dementia and Alzheimer's, because we're working our brains to the point where it doesn't have any time to not function. Yeah. So that's interesting. So just, that's something to keep in mind for your family. How important is it to you to keep the minority language? And I'm saying that because we're in the US and the majority language is English and the minority language would be Spanish. How important is it for you and your family to maintain use of that minority language at home? How important is it for you, for your child, to maintain that ability so that they can communicate with grandma or grandpa who doesn't speak the majority language? Those are really important considerations when they go to school. And again, we're not there yet, but it never hurts to talk about that, because that is legitimate. I have so many students who the family speaks Spanish and the child speaks English, and you're like, what? How do they communicate? How did that happen? How do they communicate with their family at home? And it is frustrating. It's frustrating for parents. And it's like, there's nothing that we can do as a school district because they're doing fine in school. It's really the input of Spanish at home has to be there. But also, if they were in a dual language program, it may not be like that. They may have more access to that Spanish and then have that access to communicate with their families. So definitely important to consider. That's all that I have for today for you. But of course, any questions that you have, you can always reach out to me. And hopefully this will be good for you. The Bilinguistics website has resources for parents as well. So when I initially was starting working in the field, I was like, what am I going to do? I don't know anything. And I went there and got a lot of the information. Obviously, it's gotten better and better over the 8 years that I've been in this field. But they have resources for SLPs. They also have resources for parents. So check that out. It'll be good. Thanks so much. We'll see ya. Bye.